into multiple languages, we realized there's a lot more languages than we have people in the company who speak these languages. How are we going to do it? And the way that we did it is we asked people who were in regions to help us. So if you were in, say, France, where we were starting to see some uptick in the site, we asked people in France, hey, help us translate the site into French. And they'd register as translators. We'd give them a list of all the different strings and say, tell us what you think these are. And what happens at the low end, if you don't have a lot of responses, is people will make jokes and put in all kinds of crazy stuff. But then we feed that back in and ask the next person, hey, here's what we think these are. Are these right? And ultimately what will happen is the users have the same vested interest that you do in your application or your site. They want it to work. They want it to work for them. They want it to be good and valuable and provide value in their life. So they're going to help. And what we found is after a certain threshold of users had gone through, if we'd fed back this information, we'd get accurate translations. And no specific single person did it. It didn't really depend on one person's interpretation of what the language was. It was en masse, the users making a decision. Ask them for help, they'll help you. So we do the same thing with spam. Users report spam, and if enough users report similar pieces, we'll just automatically start taking it out of the system. And the way we talk about spam and what it are these things. Some of them are a little more than your traditional email spam. I mean, clearly there is your traditional email classic messaging spam with that has text and URLs in it and goes around. But there's other things that we consider spam that are really precursors to that type of spam. Someone making lots and lots of friend requests, people who are going around and kind of cherry picking friends that have large numbers of friends so that they can be able to send messages to friends of friends, things of that nature. And then the whole creating fake accounts or compromising accounts, or even there's been some attempted session hijacking, but they're not very good at it. And we have a lot of automated methods or distributed methods to attack these. Basically, if you engage in a bunch of those behaviors before, we have automated systems that compare your actions to the actions of normal users, the distribution of all the regular people who are using the site and what they do. And as you move further and further away from that set of normal activity, you'll start seeing automated countermeasures. One of them was rate limiting. So for instance, if you're sending a lot of messages, a lot more than a normal user would, we'll start limiting the number of messages you can send by putting in an interstitial page saying you're sending too many messages, slow down. If you continue sending lots of messages because you're not a human reading that page, you're a script, then we'll start taking other methods like throwing in CAPTCHAs or keeping your messages from sending for a much longer period, which destroys the economics of the script because it takes longer for the spam messages to get out. Up to and eventually just disabling the account so it can't send any more messages. All of this happens in an automated fashion in real time. And also, if a bunch of individuals become disabled for sending similar messages, we'll start targeting that message as potential spam and we'll block it automatically and start removing it from the network. And we do that via a bunch of different classifiers, like there's a string blocking. If it's the same string, we'll look at it. If the accounts are moving messages around or deleting things, messages from us saying stop doing this, we'll look at that. And we actually have, we're working more and more on automated detection of traffic flows as opposed to content flows to do that stuff. So this is all leading up to a big case study, by the way, so that's where we're going here. Because we're in the US and California, we actually have a really good legal arsenal that we can use worldwide, and here's some of the things they are. I'm sorry I don't have any European equivalents, but if you're in the US, some of this stuff will work for you. So the first one is the CAN-SPAM Act, which is an anti-spam statute in the US, federal statute, that really you could bring our cases to the FBI or other law enforcement agencies and they could prosecute under this, but the AUSAs aren't really keen on prosecuting this law. They haven't had good luck with it. Fortunately, there's a civil damage, so we can actually, once we find the people involved, even before we find the people involved, we can sue them for for sending this type of material. And there's a statutory damage that's as high as $100 per message sent. Interestingly, in the statute, it's per message sent, not message received, which means that, for instance, if our automated systems, which they do, identify the messages as spam and start deleting them before the users ever see them, it's still, under the statute, $100 per message. So someone may make a large spam attack, our systems may catch it, remove it from the system before any user actually even sees the messages, but we still have statutory damages based on the numbers of messages sent. And some of those statutes are pretty high. I'll talk about that during the case study. And we've also got the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, both at the federal level and at the state level, that provides for civil damages for unauthorized access. The statutes don't define what unauthorized access is, which is probably a good piece of legislation because that'll change quicker than the legislation would. But our Statement of Rights and Responsibilities, our Terms of Service, does define what unauthorized access is, and that's a lot of different things. If you're interested, go look at it. I didn't want to go through them all today. Okay, so here is the chain of a typical spam attack on Facebook, and I'm going to talk through the chain. You guys probably have seen some or all of these links before, and then I'm going to discuss different ways that we interdict each section of the chain, and then what the result of that type of thing ultimately was. So first off, someone's got to identify an attack, be it may or may not rely on a threat or a vulnerability in our application or network. It may just be using the site the way it's supposed to be, sending messages to a bunch of people. But sometimes it does rely on an application layer threat, an application layer vulnerability, something. Someone at some point tries to figure that out, and that's an early warning system that something's going to happen if you start seeing that type of behavior, and I'll explain how we do that. And then they'll generally go collect a lot of accounts, and they either do this by buying big fish lists and just trying them against us to see how many work, or they'll farm friends, or some of the other mechanisms I described before on the site. Because of the social nature of Facebook, you can't just send messages to millions of people automatically. You have to have some relationship with them. So you either need to get into compromised accounts that have friends that you can send messages to, or you need to create accounts that people will friend and make a connection to, and then use those to send messages. And then you have to write or buy software to script that, because you're clearly not going to send 100 million messages by hand. So, there are people out there who will identify some way to do this, write software that they'll sell, and there's people who write their own software. Then you do the attack. This is where we get to know about you. You can go through all those previous steps without necessarily coming to our attention, but definitely once you perform the attack, start sending lots of spam, our systems will catch you and they'll alert us to you, and we'll start figuring out who you are and what you're doing. One of the first things we'll check is, where are you sending people? Because generally you're not going to make money by selling things on Facebook. You're going to send people to some other site to install malware, to get them to buy something, what have you. So where are you sending people and how are you getting them there? We'll start investigating that immediately. And then there's profit. At the end, most of the spammers are not collecting information. They're not trying to gather personal information. They're trying to get money. And that's an easy one to go after. So how do we do this stuff? To disrupt the identification of attack, someone's going to be sitting there trying things, trying to figure out how to do it. And early on, we actually caught a lot of people because they weren't really thinking that our users had any money, so they weren't trying to send them off-site, but they were really trying to collect credentials. So a lot of people were putting in CSS attacks and JavaScript rewriting of the page to try and collect usernames and passwords so they could sell elsewhere. One of the ways that we found out about that is we just decided to, at the database level, start monitoring every piece of text that someone entered into the site, stripping out obviously JavaScript and SQL and things like that. But then also, since we knew who they were, because they were logged in, or they had been logged in, or we had some mechanism to tie them to some Facebook profile, we also saved that information. And then we started following up with who are the top 10 people who are trying this all the time, or who are the top